Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us. We have still a few more people joining us, but we think we can start the presentation now. My name is Matt Lucero. I am the Director of Affinity and Domestic Engagement here at Northeastern. So first of all, I just want to say thank you all to you to joining us today. It's always great to have our alumni and friends join us for our different presentations. And along with that, I know you don't really want to hear from me. We want to hear about the presentation. So I'm going to actually pass it off to Professor Steffel, who is going to be able to give us a great conversation about the dynamics of delegation.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my research with you all today. I'm Dr. Mary Steffel. I'm a professor of marketing here at Northeastern University. I study consumer judgment and decision-making. I study when people recruit others to help them make decisions, when people make decisions on behalf of others and how they do so effectively. And then how do we lend better decision support, whether that be as friends, as advisors, or even as businesses or governments. I also have experience serving on the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team under President Obama. And I have served on the Office of Evaluation Sciences for the General Services Administration since that time. So it's been an ongoing collaboration, applying my background in psychology and in marketing to figuring out how to make government a little bit more user-friendly and easier for consumers to navigate. So what I'd like to share with you today is some research that I've been doing on the dynamics of delegation. So having the freedom to make choices for oneself is considered by many people in our culture to be an inalienable right. Research on preference for choice has shown that people overwhelmingly prefer to maintain responsibility for choosing, even when they would be better off by letting others choose on their behalf. But this preference for choice only goes so far. It also seems likely that people might sometimes prefer freedom from choice. It isn't hard to think of examples of people recruiting others to make decisions so that they don't have to. Employees often look to their bosses to help them determine what business strategies to implement. Consumers often turn to salespeople to help them make purchase decisions. And patients often rely on their doctors to help them select which treatments they should undergo. Now, given the apparent contradiction between people's preference for choice and the ubiquity of choice delegation in everyday life, it's interesting to consider under what circumstances people might actually prefer to let others choose on their behalf. Each of these contexts actually represents a different project of mine that explores the dynamics of delegation. In the first, I show that people who face the burden of making choices on behalf of other people are more likely to delegate those choices in order to pass the buck or avoid the responsibility and blame associated with a possible poor outcome. In the second, I show that consumers consider choice delegation as a viable strategy for avoiding responsibility for a difficult decision, and that giving people the option to delegate can be a great way to empower consumers to walk away with something rather than nothing, rather than walking away from those difficult choices empty-handed. And then in the third, I show that patients presented with medical decisions in a difficult to process format delegate those choices to their doctors, and that making medical information easier to process, even superficially, can empower consumers to participate in decisions regarding their medical care. So let me start by considering when people might delegate in order to avoid the burden of choosing on behalf of other people. One of the experiences that got me thinking about this was around lunchtime for our daily ritual with my colleagues at the University of Florida when I was a postdoc. Come noon, we'd all take a break from working and we'd all head out to lunch. By the time we get to the bottom of the stairwell and had to decide where to eat, we'd all stand there with our fingers to our noses, hoping not to be it, because none of us wanted to be saddled with the responsibility of choosing a restaurant on everyone else's behalf. Personal decisions are difficult enough, but choices for others often come with additional personal and interpersonal burdens. Choices for others come with these burdens like responsibility, people tend to feel worse about being responsible for decisions that inflict negative consequences onto others than decisions that inflict those same consequences onto themselves. Moreover, people making decisions for others also face being blamed or evaluated negatively for making a poor choice, even when the choice set itself is composed entirely of negative options. So no matter what you choose, others might attribute negative traits to you if they aren't happy with the outcome. So for this reason, we hypothesize that people may be more likely to delegate choices for other people than choices for themselves, especially those with potentially bad outcomes. Moreover, we anticipate that this delegation may be driven both by this anticipated responsibility and this anticipated blame from others. What I'll suggest is that delegation is not merely one of many possible effective routes to handling the burden of choice, but rather that it's uniquely suited to relieve this burden. Delegation, by virtue of passing the responsibility for that decision to another person, may uniquely enable people to avoid the burden of responsibility or blame that might come with making a choice on others' behalf. Now, other strategies that people might use when they're faced with a difficult decision, one is they might delay the choice, but delaying a choice may put off choosing for a while, but it doesn't avert it altogether. Another strategy people may use when they're faced with difficult decisions is they may just flip a coin, use some kind of chance device. Again, that may easily resolve the decision, but the coin can't assume responsibility or blame for that choice. So it doesn't really relieve that potential threat of responsibility or blame for a choice that might be unpopular. So we hypothesize that people avoid choosing for others by delegating, but not by using these other choice avoidance tactics that may be very common in other situations when people are choosing for themselves. We'll also look at to whom people delegate. And my computer's frozen for the moment. Let me take a moment to see if I can get this moving again. All right. So people are likely to also be selective about to whom they're willing to delegate. So people may look for expertise in the people to whom they delegate. Delegation may at times result in a better decision because somebody more knowledgeable or more expert ends up making the final decision about the outcome. So that's certainly possible, but to sort of hint at the results, what we actually find is that while expertise is desirable, it's not a necessary characteristic in a surrogate. People will often delegate decisions to somebody even without domain expertise, if what they're really trying to do is avoid responsibility and blame. In that sort of a situation, anybody who can shoulder that responsibility and blame will do. Now, note, however, though, that if what people are doing is trying to delegate that choice to somebody who can shoulder responsibility and blame instead of them, authority may be essential. So people for whom choosing is outside of their purview, they can't assume that choice responsibility. It may be unlikely that people are going to see that person as somebody who is appropriate to shoulder that responsibility. And in fact, the phrase "the buck stops here" expresses the idea that the person who's ultimately responsible for the organization's actions is a person at the top of the heap, the person with the authority to make that decision. That person at the end of the line has no one else to whom they can pass the buck. So again, we're going to hypothesize that people delegate choices for others only to surrogates with the authority to assume responsibility and blame, and that may be regardless of expertise. So in this first part of the talk, then, I'm going to present a few studies that show when and why people pass the buck, whether passing the buck is more than just an easy way out, whether there's something special about delegation that enables us to avoid this responsibility and blame relative to other ways of dealing with a difficult choice. And then what are the necessary traits of a surrogate? What do people look for in somebody to whom they might delegate a decision? So in our first study, we asked participants to imagine that they were choosing a hotel for either themselves or for their boss for an upcoming business trip. And we gave them a series of options that were either all extremely unattractive or all extremely attractive. And we told them these were the only options that the business had available to them. And we asked participants whether they would prefer to choose a hotel themselves or whether they'd rather delegate this decision to the office manager. What we find is that people were more likely to delegate decisions for their boss, for another person, than they were to delegate decisions for themselves. So that's our 2 red bars compared to our 2 gray bars here. Additionally, people were more likely to delegate decisions that were between unattractive options than decisions that were between attractive options, suggesting that it might be more attractive to avoid having to make those decisions. But most importantly, there is an interaction. And what that means here is that people were most likely to delegate these choices between unattractive options when they were choosing for their boss than in any other condition. And what's so significant about that is it suggests that people are trying to pass the buck in these situations where there's a potential for this decision to be unpopular with others, such that they would feel bad about being responsible, and they might anticipate that that boss would blame them if they're unhappy with the hotel that they chose. So you might be wondering, why do people do this? Why do people pass the buck? I'm sorry, I don't know why this keeps freezing, guys. One possibility is it just a lack of concern. Do people just not care as much about somebody else's experience than their own? Another possibility is that people may just not want to put so much effort into a decision that's just going to affect somebody else than a decision that's going to affect them personally. The other possibilities, as I've alluded to earlier, are that perhaps it's that people are concerned about feeling responsible for a potentially negative decision that would affect others more so than they'd feel responsible if it was for themselves, and that they'd be more concerned about anticipated blame when choosing for somebody else and for themselves. So in the next study, we actually asked people, to what extent do you care about whether you or your boss has a good or bad experience? If you were to make this decision yourself, how difficult would this decision feel? To what extent would you like to be responsible for this decision, whatever the outcome? And to what extent would you like to receive the credit or the blame for the decision, whatever the outcome? Now, we're able to rule this first one out right away because people seem to care just as much about their boss's experience as their own in this particular survey. But these other 3 all seem to be possible candidates. It was more difficult to make a decision for somebody else than for the self. People anticipated wanting to be responsible to a lesser extent when they were choosing for somebody else and for themselves. And they also wanted less of the credit or blame when they were choosing for their boss and for themselves. So here we looked at the relationship between all these things and whether some of these factors could actually explain that relationship between the tendency for people to be more likely to delegate that decision when choosing for their boss and for themselves. What we found is that, as we predicted, the desire to avoid responsibility for the choice and the desire to avoid that credit or blame for the choice explain the relationship between people's preference to delegate and whether they were choosing for themselves or for their boss. And that anticipated difficulty of the choice, while they did anticipate it to be more difficult to choose for their boss and for themselves, that did not predict their likelihood of wanting to delegate. So it doesn't really seem like people just don't want to have to deal with a difficult decision on someone else's behalf than for themselves, that it really has something more to do with this responsibility and blame. And of course, in this particular situation, this was all moderated by the attractiveness of the choice options. As long as those options are attractive, none of these things were as much of a concern to people. We don't see that self-other difference quite as much. It's only when the options are unattractive and there's that potential risk of feeling responsible for someone else's negative outcomes or being blamed for an unpopular outcome that people were really driven to want to delegate that decision and give that responsibility and blame to somebody else. So the conclusion of this study was really that it's this felt responsibility and anticipated blame that are underlying these preferences. Now you might be wondering, well, which is it? Is it both of these things or is it one or the other? So we actually ran a study to try to tease that apart. In this case, people were choosing a hotel either for themselves or for their boss. But within the boss conditions, we had some people choose for their boss, and we told them, you know what? Your boss is never going to know who made this decision. You're actually choosing this anonymously, and your boss will know the outcome of the decision, but they won't know who made it. In the other condition, we told them, your boss is going to know that you chose the hotel for them. And so they're ultimately going to be aware that it was your decision to put them up at that particular hotel. And again, we had them choose between an unattractive versus a set of attractive options. Because again, we anticipated that this effect would be stronger in cases where the options were unattractive than when they were attractive. And we looked again at whether people preferred to make this decision themselves or delegate it to the office manager. And here's what we found. When the options were unattractive, you can see that people were much more interested in delegating this decision to somebody else, especially when it was for their boss than when it was for themselves. But I think what I really want to point out for you guys is the difference between these bars right here, the light gray and the dark gray bars. What we're seeing here is that in either case where you're choosing for somebody else, you're more likely to delegate than when you're choosing for yourself. But there is a difference here. So people are most likely to delegate when their identity will be known, suggesting that blame is important. But in this other condition where you're choosing for your boss and they're never going to know that you made that decision, we still see a big difference in delegation between choosing in that condition than choosing for yourself, which suggests that it's not all about blame. That feeling of responsibility in and of itself is enough to motivate people to want to pass the buck. So you might look at this and say, people are just trying to avoid blame. That's part of it, but that's not the whole story. So another thing we wanted to look at here was, is passing the buck more than just an easy way out? Is flipping a coin or putting this decision off until later equally viable options to delegating a decision to somebody else? We, again, suggest that delegation is uniquely suited to relieve the burden of choosing because it allows you to pass responsibility and blame to another person. And so we tested each of these things. In our study 3, we asked people to consider a decision, and they had to decide whether they wanted to choose themselves or delegate, as in the previous studies that I showed you. But in another condition, the options that we gave them was, do you want to choose yourself or do you want to just delay this decision and make a decision at the end of the week? What we found is that people were not more likely to delay the decision until the end of the week when choosing for somebody else than when choosing for themselves, in part because that's not going to help you avoid that responsibility and blame. Additionally, we looked to see whether flipping a coin would also give people that sense of a way out. But again, as we predicted, people were not actually more likely to flip a coin when choosing for somebody else than for themselves. Again, because you can't blame the coin, or you can't pass responsibility to the coin as easily as to another person. So in the last couple studies, we looked at what are the necessary traits of a surrogate. When you're looking for somebody to whom to pass the buck or delegate a decision, what kinds of people do you look for? We suggest that people are going to be selective about to whom they're willing to delegate. And in our study 5, we looked at expertise. We asked people to imagine that they were making a decision and that about where to locate an event at a conference in another city. And we gave people the option of delegating to a coworker who either had never been to that city before and didn't know much about it, but who offered to help make the decision, or to somebody who was very familiar with that city and offered to make that decision. And what we found is that while expertise was desirable, people were more likely to delegate the decision to the expert than the non-expert. It wasn't necessary. So when that decision was for somebody else rather than for themselves, they were still more likely to delegate that decision even to a complete non-expert. And we hypothesize that while expertise may be desirable but unnecessary, that authority would be important, because if what you're really trying to do is avoid responsibility and blame, you need to be able to pass that responsibility and blame onto somebody else. So we ran a study in which we asked participants to imagine that they could delegate that decision upward to their supervisor, who presumably had the responsibility and the authority to be able to take that burden on, or whether they wanted to delegate that decision to somebody that they supervised, somebody that they might not feel could actually assume that responsibility and blame in their place. And indeed, what we found was that authority was really essential to assume for people to want to delegate that decision to the other person. People only delegated the decision to a boss who had the authority to assume that responsibility. They did not delegate to somebody that they themselves supervised. And when we followed up with our participants, it was because they felt like, even if I delegate this to my subordinate, I'm still ultimately going to feel responsible for the decision. And I'm ultimately going to be the one that's going to be blamed because I supervise this person. I was charged with making the decision. I don't think that I can avoid the blame just by asking them to do it on my behalf. So what we concluded from this first project was that people are more likely to delegate choices for others than for themselves, especially when a poor or unpopular outcome is likely. This is driven by a desire to avoid blame and responsibility for bad decisions. And we find that delegation confers benefits that other forms of choice avoidance do not. Flipping a coin or putting off a decision doesn't allow you to avoid responsibility and blame the same way delegating enables people to do so. And finally, people only delegate to people with the authority to assume choice responsibility. They aren't more likely to delegate to people if they feel like they themselves are still going to maintain that responsibility and blame, even if they were to delegate. So before we move on to the next project, I do want to take a moment to see if we have any questions in the chat thus far.
Yeah, Mary, so there was a question back a little further on one of the slides that you had with all the vectors on it. There was a question on what was the numbers on those vectors. It was like 2 point something something and 4 point something something with some asterisks over it.
So that's the so I wasn't going to get too much into the statistics here, but that's the beta coefficients. We ran a mediation model, which is a series of regressions, and those are the coefficients or the correlations, you can think of it, between whether people were making a decision for themselves or somebody else, and each of our potential mediators. So the extent to which people wanted to avoid responsibility and the extent to which people wanted to avoid potential blame for the decision. And then again, the correlation between those constructs and our final outcomes of whether or not people delegated that decision to somebody else. And so I can actually show you that slide one more time if you're curious. So these numbers are telling you that when you're making a decision for your boss rather than for the self, there's a strong and significant, that's what the stars mean, a significant relationship between that and responsibility and that and anticipated blame. And that you see these are negative. So essentially what that's saying is the more you want to be responsible, the more you want to assume credit, the less you're going to want to delegate. So when you're choosing for yourself, you want to be responsible. You want to assume credit. And so therefore you're not going to delegate. When you're choosing on behalf of your boss, you don't want those things. And so you're not going to want to delegate. So that's what we're seeing there in terms of all of these. And so anytime you see these stars, it's telling you that relationship is a statistically significant relationship. And so when you're seeing a dotted line here, what that's saying is that that's not statistically significant. What we're seeing is that although there is a relationship between whether you're choosing for yourself and for a boss and how difficult that choice seems like it would be, there is not a relationship between the anticipated difficulty of the choice and whether or not you delegate it in this particular study. Does that clarify that for you guys?
I think so, yes.
Excellent, excellent.
There was
Any
one
other
other
question?
Yep, so there's a couple that have just kind of come in, and you might actually get to this later on in the presentation. So if you are, you can do that. But from this research, what would you recommend to help people overcome their fear of passing the buck or taking the blame? As a business owner, I want my staff to delegate appropriate tasks.
It's a great question. So there are situations in which you want people to, so say that one more time. So is your goal to get people to be more likely to delegate, or your goal to be,
I think it's
get people less likely to delegate and assume responsibility themselves?
Yeah, I think it's the fear of passing the buck and taking the blame. Like how does one overcome that? And as a business owner, like to be able to help people take on those tasks, to be able to feel comfortable delegating.
Comfortable delegating. Got
Yes.
it. Got it. So generally speaking, I think people are going to actually want to delegate in situations where they might be concerned about shouldering responsibility and blame. So that's going to be something they're going to tend to want to do anyway. And when somebody is in a position of authority, or they're the top of the food chain, so to speak, those are the situations where people may be less willing to delegate, even in situations where actually delegation might not be a bad idea, in order to maybe be more efficient with decision making, or to maybe put the decision in better hands in the case of a situation where there might be somebody else who's an expert, so in that kind of a situation, I think shifting the focus to away from the decision maker themselves. So getting them to focus on the decision itself and making sure that you come up with the best possible outcome, rather than sort of how is this going to reflect on me, I think is important. In other research, we find that there is sometimes a backlash when leaders delegate decisions to others, as opposed to simply asking for advice. And to avoid the potential backlash of delegating decisions, one thing that is important to do is to make it clear that you're not necessarily trying to offload your responsibility. That's not your intention, but rather you're sharing a responsibility that was already the responsibility of your team or of your firm. Another tactic is reciprocity, is that, if you're asking for somebody to help with a decision, to offer to make sure that you return the favor in the future and make it clear that you're willing to do that, can also offset those negative consequences where people don't see you as trying to be manipulative or unethical or even immoral by avoiding your responsibilities and shirking those responsibilities. So those are some things that as a leader you can try to do to, manage those perceptions. And some of that sort of may make it more palatable for people to go ahead and do that.
Great. There's a couple other questions if you want to tackle them now. Or if you want to go into the presentation.
Why don't I hold those for the next section? That way we can return to those, but I can talk about the next project as well.
Sounds good.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Keep the questions coming. I'm hoping that we'll have some time at the end to talk more about some of these. So the second project looked at choice delegation in a consumer context. So avoiding responsibility and blame for other people's outcomes. are likely not the only factors that prompt people to delegate decisions. Indeed, people often delegate personal decisions for which these factors are unlikely to be at play. In the next project, we'll consider another reason why people delegate. In this project, we explore the dynamics of delegation in a different context. Instead of looking at delegation in an organizational context, we now consider when consumers might delegate shopping decisions to other people, whether that be waiters, salespeople, healthcare professionals, or friends and family members. And before I get too far into this, actually, let me just flag. I've actually written a paper for Harvard Business Review that actually is designed for people like the person who asked the last question on, how do I, encourage my employees to take decision responsibility when they should and delegate in situations where it's important to delegate. And actually, we talk through some of those dynamics in that paper. So if you remind me, I'd be happy to share that paper with the group afterward, because it does go into a little bit more detail and offers some more concrete recommendations. All right, so there's a wide body of research in social psychology and in marketing showing that people often cope with difficult decisions by avoiding them altogether. They defer them to a later point in time. They retain the default rather than making an active decision about what's best for them, or they don't make any choice at all. So, when given a whole bunch of different jams to sample and consider at the grocery store, they're less likely to buy any of those jams than when there's a smaller, more manageable number of options to choose from. But there are times when choosing nothing is not an option, or when walking away empty-handed is unappealing. Imagine making a decision between healthcare plans that's complex and difficult. You're probably better off choosing one healthcare plan, regardless of whether it's the very best possible healthcare plan, than not having any health coverage at all, right? So there are situations in which you don't want to choose nothing. Something is better in that particular situation. Now, thus far, research on choice avoidance is largely focused on the choice and the individual making it, rather than the broader social context in which that choice is situated. Consequently, is given less consideration to the idea that other people can serve as a resource to the decision maker, and that delegating choices to others may be an often utilized strategy for avoiding the burden of responsibility associated with making a difficult decision, and an appealing alternative to walking away from a difficult choice without having anything to show for it. So we're going to suggest that actually delegation may be a great alternative in these decisions. These are personal decisions in this case, rather than choices for other people. What we might suggest is that people might delegate these difficult decisions compared to easier choices. And we suspect that difficulty might increase delegation because it, similarly to the last study, makes people worry about being responsible for potentially making the wrong decision. And so it maybe encourages them to reduce or even try to evade that responsibility, even though, again, that's responsibility that they feel about their own ownership over the decision. This isn't anything about blame by others. Now, there may be a couple different negative feelings that may come from feeling responsible for a decision that has a negative outcome. Disappointment and regret both capture a person's reaction to having made a bad choice, but what differentiates them is that when people feel disappointed, that's when a choice doesn't turn out the way that they'd hoped, regardless of whether they caused the failure or that they had a hand in the choice. But people feel regret if they bear responsibility for a less than optimal choice. So the difference between choice and regret is disappointment is, the outcome wasn't as good as I'd hoped it would be. Regret is the outcome isn't as good as I hoped it would be, and it's my fault because I made that decision. So although both of these anticipated emotions could encourage delegation, we suspect that this anticipated regret is more likely to directly prompt delegation, as delegation may provide the means of escaping regret by reducing your own responsibility for the choice and passing it to somebody else. So anticipated disappointment is less likely to directly prompt delegation, as resolving the decision via delegation doesn't eliminate and can actually potentially even increase the possibility that the choice might turn out poorly. So again, we anticipate that anticipated regret, but not disappointment, is going to prompt people to delegate difficult choices. Now, Delegation, again, is not the only means by which people can avoid making difficult decisions. Another common way in which people escape tough choices is by refusing to choose at all. Whereas both delegation and opting out of choosing may both be appealing when either one, but not the other, is available as an alternative to making a difficult decision oneself, when both delegation and opting out are available as alternatives, delegation may be uniquely attractive when choices are difficult, but choosing is necessary or desirable because it enables people to avoid feeling at fault if the choice is suboptimal, while still allowing them to get something out of the decision. Whereas opting out necessitates that the decision maker walks away empty-handed. So we suspect that providing opportunities for consumers to delegate may allow consumers to get the benefits of choosing without the risk of regret. So we hypothesize then that having the option to delegate, so having a salesperson present to whom you can delegate a decision, for example, might ameliorate the tendency to opt out of that difficult choice. So it might make it less likely that your customer is going to walk out of the store overwhelmed with indecision rather than just having chosen something. So in this package, I'm going to show you a few studies. The first looks at whether people are more likely to delegate these difficult decisions to others. The second study is going to look at why do people do that? And finally, we're going to look at what are the consequences of delegation. So in the first study, we wanted to do something with some real consequences for our participants. So under the guise of an experiment about rating advertisements, participants learned that they'd be receiving a free set of headphones that they could use to listen to an ad and take home with them at the end of the study. In an easy condition, one of those was a silver pair of earbuds, and the other was a black pair of over-the-head earphones. In the difficult condition, one was a pair of silver earbuds and one was a pair of gray earbuds. So we pre-tested these and found that most people found it pretty easy to choose the earbuds over the earphones, but they've had a harder time choosing between the gray and the silver earbuds. Then we gave participants the option to choose which earphones they wanted to keep themselves or whether they wanted the experimenter to choose a set of earbuds for them. What we found is that in this situation where people are actually taking this home with them at the end of the study, people were more likely to just let the experimenter pick some earbuds for them when the decision was more difficult than when it was more easy. Now, what we liked about this demonstration is that it established our effect in a setting with real enduring consequences, but to be sure that this was a thing, we also performed several conceptual replications using different stimuli and different manipulations of choice difficulty. So people delegated difficult versus easy decisions, regardless of whether choice difficulty was varied via the relative attractiveness of the options, the number of options, whether those options involve difficult trade-offs, or even whether we just simply presented the options in a easy to read or a hard to read font. And that last one, it sounds, why would you do that? Well, the reason why is that, we can keep the content of the choice exactly the same. And the only thing that we're changing is whether it feels hard because you're having to kind of squint and struggle to read it versus not. It's a nice tool to be able to really very precisely isolate this feeling of choice difficulty is what's driving these decisions rather than something else that might differ between the different kinds of choices. Now, we also found that people delegated difficult versus easy decisions, both when choices were important and when they were unimportant. So you might think, well, yeah, sure, you delegate a decision between earphones because who cares? Like you could just throw those away at the end. But we find that even when people are faced with an important decision, like what doctor to see, people were still more likely to delegate that decision to somebody else when that decision was difficult than when it was easy. We also found that this was true both when the surrogate was and was not an expert. So just like in our last study, expertise is desirable, but it's not necessary for delegation. Again, if your goal is to avoid regretting making the wrong decision, even a friend who may not be an expert on the decision, who's willing to make the decision for you, might help you feel a little less regretful or responsible for the decision if you just let them make the decision for you. So we next explored, why do they do this? What prompts people to delegate? Is it the desire to avoid the disappointment associated with a bad outcome, independent of whether they chose it or not? Or is it the desire to avoid the regret associated with being responsible for bringing about that bad outcome? So in this experiment, we manipulated both choice difficulty and the overall attractiveness of the available options. And if you remember that last study, when choosing for other people, the attractiveness of the options was important. We suspect when you're choosing for yourself, the attractiveness of the options actually may not matter as much. That it really may have to do with whether or not you feel like you've made the right or wrong choice. So how similar and attractive those options are and how difficult the choice is, rather than the overall attractiveness of the options. So if people delegate merely to avoid disappointment, then they might be especially likely to delegate when the options are all unappealing and that there's a good chance of the outcome of the decision being unpleasant. But if, as we predict, people delegate primarily to avoid regret, then they may delegate the most when options are close in appeal, and it seems quite possible that they might wish that they had chosen the other option, and they might want to kick themselves afterward because they felt like they had made a mistake. So in this setting, we asked participants to imagine that they came across an ice cream truck selling 14 flavors of gourmet ice cream. Participants ranked the flavors from most appealing to least appealing by dragging and dropping the images into the appropriate order. For those of you who spent any time in Ohio, these are Jenny's ice cream flavors. They're fabulous. They also have them at Wegmans if you want to give them a try. So what we did then next is that we gave people a choice between two options. And we selected those options to be either easy or hard to choose from, or attractive or unattractive overall. So in our easy attractive condition, people chose between their first and seventh favorite ice cream flavor. In the easy unattractive condition, they chose between their 8th and 14th favorite ice cream flavors. So again, you can see like these are more attractive flavors than these ones, but overall, these are both pretty easy decisions. You're choosing between two options that you feel pretty starkly different about. In our hard conditions, we had people make choices between options that are more similar in attractiveness, that they ranked very similarly. So they chose between their 4th and 5th ranked flavor or their 8th and 9th favorite flavors. So again, you see there's this difference in attractiveness, but they're both more difficult decisions between options that are similar in that person's eyes. And we asked, would you rather choose the flavor yourself or just delegate to the salesperson? So what we found here, I'm throwing some statistics at you guys. Hopefully you bear with me, but essentially what we're seeing here is that we found a strong effect of choice difficulty. The more difficult the decision, the more likely they were to delegate the choice. What we see here is actually when you're looking at your significance value, you want that to be smaller than 0.05. That means that there's a smaller than 5% chance that these results were just due to chance. And so what this is saying is that there really wasn't an effect of attractiveness here in people's decisions. The overall attractiveness of the flavors really didn't affect whether they delegated. And similarly, there's only a marginal interaction between difficulty and attractiveness, meaning that, again, the effect of the attractiveness of the options didn't really depend on how difficult the choice was. So with that in mind, the key finding here was that choice difficulty, again, led to increased delegation. And this is by increasing the feeling of difficulty and increasing concerns about anticipated regret. And that ultimately led to that delegation. And for those who want to see the full numbers, this is, again, very similar to that figure that I showed you guys earlier. These are all coefficients. And if they have stars next to them, if the line is solid rather than dotted, that means there is a significant, meaningful relationship there. So again, the simple version of this is the big takeaway. Choice difficulty makes it feel more difficult. Our manipulation of difficulty made it feel more difficult, which made people more concerned that they would regret the decision, which resulted in more delegation. Here's the full model if we throw in attractiveness and disappointment as well. So what are the consequences of delegation? Past research has shown that shoppers are sometimes less likely to make a purchase from a large array of options than from a small array of options, despite the fact that a greater number of options should only increase the likelihood that one of those options should prove appealing. Yet choosing and walking away are not often people's only options. In many cases, people have the ability to delegate that decision to somebody else. Imagine if you were shopping for tea. I used to be a huge fan of the store Teavana. I don't know if you guys remember that. Sort of like a David's tea, but you go into the store and they've just got a wall of different tea flavors. So I loved it, but I would often get overwhelmed when I walked in there. And so this inspired this particular study. What we did is we asked participants to imagine they walked into a store that had either 6 or that wall of 30 different teas to choose from. And we manipulated also whether people were told that they had to make this decision on their own, or whether there was a store employee who approached them and asked if they'd like any help in choosing a tea. So here we're giving people either the option to delegate or not. Then we looked at the percentage of people who ultimately chose to choose a tea and buy something. So here what we looked at was whether people chose to pass for the time being and not purchase anything. So we'll call that a non-purchase, or whether they chose to purchase something. Either I'm going to choose a package of tea myself and I'm going to buy that one, or I'm going to tell the store employee which teas I'm considering and I'm going to buy whichever one he or she recommends. So in either case, I'm purchasing something, but in one case, I'm choosing it myself. In the other case, I'm delegating it to the salesperson. So what we found was that when people were on their own to make this decision, there was no salesperson present. We replicated what past research often finds, is that when there are many teas to choose from, people are more likely to walk away without purchasing anything. Like, I'm overwhelmed, I'm just not going to get anything right now. So this is your typical choice overload effect. The question is, can giving people the option to delegate make them less likely to walk away empty-handed when they're given a large, complicated array of options to choose from? And this is indeed what we found. People were more likely to make a purchase when they were presented with a large set of options, by virtue, in most cases, of delegating that decision to the salesperson and purchasing whatever that salesperson recommended. In fact, if you compare these numbers in the large set condition, when there was a salesperson and when there wasn't, people were actually twice as likely to purchase a tea when there was that salesperson present to whom they could delegate than when there wasn't. So what we can conclude from this is that people often delegate difficult decisions, and anticipated regret as opposed to disappointment often prompts delegation. And that having the option to delegate can mitigate the tendency to opt out of difficult choices altogether. So for the sake of time, I'm going to actually present this last set of studies for you, just to show you one more context where this matters. And then I'll take some questions about any of the 3 projects that we've talked about today. So in this last product, I was interested in exploring the dynamics of delegation in yet another context, this case in medical decision-making. Whereas in the past lines of research, we focus on situations in which people may expect to make their own decisions unless they recruit others to offer them decision support. And focusing on medical decision-making, here we consider a case in which decisions are often expected to be made with the help and guidance of medical professionals or other caregivers. And I was interested in applying what we just learned to take on the challenge of how do we empower medical patients to take a more active role and have a voice in decisions regarding their health. We know from past research that although many people say that they want to be involved in decisions regarding their health, they often report that they did not end up participating as much as they desired. So more and more, doctors, policymakers, researchers are recognizing the importance of engaging patients in decisions about their health to ensure that people get the treatments and interventions that best fit their needs, preferences, and lifestyles. And so the goal here then is to think about how do we use these insights from these other studies in order to empower people not to delegate, but to rather take an active role in decisions that affect them. So just as objective difficulty increases choice avoidance, we expect that subjective difficulty may do the same thing. So seeing a medical decision being described in complex jargon, in fine print at the bottom of that pharmaceutical ad, or in the sort of notoriously hard to read doctor's handwriting, some of those things, they may not seem that big of a deal in that particular context, but those may be significant barriers to a patient who maybe doesn't have the specific vocabulary or the confidence to make this decision themselves. And those things may just further undermine their confidence and their ability to make a good decision. So we suggest that increasing the fluency or the ease by which medical information can be processed, again, even superficially, may boost participation in medical decisions. So we know that choice difficulty undermines confidence, but that making things more fluent by making the font more readable, making things easier to recall, or repeating things can increase people's confidence. And so in this paper, what we're going to look at is whether fluency can increase participation simply by boosting confidence, even in the absence of any kind of meaningful differences in comprehension. And this was important to us because, of course, presenting choices in a way that's impossible for somebody to understand is going to make them less likely to participate in that decision. But we're going to suggest that even when consumers fully understand the decision, this kind of disfluency can still undermine their subjective confidence and make them doubt themselves to the point that they don't take an active role in these decisions regarding their health. So we're going to look at whether increasing choice fluency can boost participation, and then why does fluency increase participation? So in our first study, we presented participants with a choice between heartburn medications. These are over-the-counter medications, either in a table or a paragraph format. So here's the table format. This is somewhat easy to process, certainly easier to process or more fluent than this paragraph format. And we looked to see whether people preferred to choose a medication themselves or delegate that decision to a pharmacist. What we find is that they're more likely to delegate that decision to the pharmacist when they were presented with a disfluent paragraph version of the description of these medications than the more fluent table format of the medications. So this allows us to at least conceptually see that there's a relationship there. We also looked at a couple of variables that are of a lot of interest in this domain, which is health literacy. So this is people's ability to understand medical information and use it to make decisions regarding their health. We wanted to see if that mattered here as well. And what we found is that fluency influenced delegation more among those with inadequate health fluency. What this means is that for somebody who has a lot of difficulty understanding medical information and making a good decision with that information, they're the ones that benefit the most by putting those decisions in plain language, presenting them in a way that's easy for that person to process and understand. We also looked at past experience because we expected that might matter as well. And what we found is that people with past experiences were less likely to delegate the decision than those who didn't have past experience, in this case with heartburn, but it didn't interact with choice difficulty. So what we find is that the fluency benefited people both with and without past experience. And so then finally, we looked at why. So in this version, we gave people a decision of whether or not to get surgery for an injury that they sustained. And we either presented it in plain language or medical jargon. So this is another way of manipulating the ease of processing, and perhaps a more common way that people encounter this when they're actually in these kinds of situations. Is a doctor talking to them in terms that are easy for them to understand? Or are they using a lot of medical jargon that might be confusing or at least intimidating to them? So we said you can choose to undergo surgery to remove blood that's collected around your spinal cord and stop the bleeding, or you can choose to undergo surgical evacuation of the hematoma, the extravasated blood that has collected around your C4 vertebrae, and endovascular embolization to selectively occlude the affected blood vessels and arrest the bleeding. We did do a lot of pre-testing with this to make sure that our participants could actually understand both versions. You might think the second one is tougher to understand. Our participants were able to understand both on an objective level and answer some questions correctly about each of these scenarios. But what we find is that the latter version really undermined their confidence in their ability to make a good decision. So here we measured people's preference for control. It's sort of a more subtle way of measuring whether people want to participate in the decision. What we found is that people were more likely to want to prefer a more passive role in the decision when it was presented in this medical jargon than it was when it was presented in a more fluent, plain language way. So we didn't actually see much of a difference in those wanting to take an active role. It's those who might otherwise play no role in the decision that were most influenced here, right? So we're seeing people going from saying, hey, I want some role in this decision, or I feel comfortable making it myself, to suddenly some people are saying, I'm out. I have no idea. You tell me what to do. And then we look to see whether subjective confidence could explain this relationship. And again, this is just like those figures I showed you guys before. What we see is there's the more medical jargon was present in that description, the more it undermined people's subjective confidence, and the more they preferred a more passive role in the decision. And this was even when we only include participants who correctly could answer a bunch of trivia questions about the scenarios that they saw, suggesting that their objective comprehension was unchanged. So what this suggests is that making medical choices feel easier, even if it's just superficially, can do a lot to empower people to participate in health decisions. Fluency influences participation more among people with low health literacy and regardless of past experience. Finally, fluency increases participation by boosting confidence, even when comprehension or confidence or trust in the doctor is unchanged. So for those of you who want to learn more, today I have talked to you about my work on passing the buck, on choice delegation, as well as patient participation. These are published respectively in the Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes, Journal of Consumer Research, and forthcoming in the Journal of the Association of Consumer Research. And the conclusions from each of these studies is that when choice is a burden, people seek freedom from blame, they delegate when they're apprehensive, and they choose when they're assured. My work on choice delegation has shown people delegate when choice is a challenge, they seek freedom from regret, they delegate when overwhelmed, and they choose when they're enabled. And finally, my work on patient participation suggests when choice is a capability, people seek freedom from uncertainty, they delegate when intimidated, and they choose when they're empowered. I also encourage you guys, if you're interested in this topic, to check out my TED Talk, What You Gain by Giving Choices Away. It also goes under the name How I Overcame Decision Paralysis. It's about 12 minutes long. It gives a great summary of some of this research with some more personal, close to home examples of how learning to delegate when I'm otherwise paralyzed with indecision really changed my life and enabled me to make sure that I walked away from really important decisions with something to show for it rather than nothing. And I want to end by just thanking you all for coming out today. And I would be happy to stick around if folks have questions. I realize we're at time, so I'm also happy to follow up with people offline. Please do feel free to circulate my email with folks if there's people who have questions and want to follow up in addition.
Great, thank you. Just because there are a few questions that are going to be here. This was recorded, just so everyone knows. So it will be up on our Northeastern Alumni YouTube channel, probably early next week, I would say. It's a little while just to kind of make sure that we're managing this. There were a couple of just asks about the slides, and I can kind of work with the professor to see if we might be able to get some of those out to everyone. But along with that too, I just want to also just say thank you to everyone too for joining us. There was one question on here that I think might be interesting to do, just to kind of end on before we kind of go. Just because I think it's pertinent for our wonderful field that we're in, which is in the academic setting. When you're a PhD student, how can you delegate tasks that don't require creativity, and how do you find the people to do so?
That's an excellent question. So, so I often, as a grad student and even as a professor, will delegate work to undergraduate research assistants or other graduate research assistants or collaborators even. And I think in those cases, it's important to think about, which of these tasks are something that I feel comfortable entrusting to somebody else, or if I'm not entirely comfortable trusting somebody else with it entirely, rather than fully delegate it to them, I still give myself veto power or editing power in the end, where I can sit down with them, see what they've created, and edit it and move it forward. I think the biggest problem we often face as academics, as grad students and as professors, is we sort of feel like we have to do it all ourselves, that it's somehow we're afraid to delegate it to other people because we either don't think that they're going to do it the same way we would, or that we don't feel like we should delegate those decisions. But I find that my best works comes from working in collaboration with others, and that if you can kind of bring on some great research assistants, I know that at Northeastern, if you're teaching any classes or TAing for any classes, or if the advisor that you're working with as a grad student is teaching any classes, you can recruit in classes. And I found there's been a great response. Every fall, there's a source event where there are students who are interested in getting involved in research. And there's a big forum for faculty and students to introduce themselves to each other and get connected on research. So that's another great way to do it. And so those might be some great ways to recruit those kinds of individuals. And then I would just work on training yourself to think about, what are these tasks that I can delegate and feel comfortable delegating? How do I then also give myself the opportunity to sit down with these folks and make sure that what they've done also has a little bit of both of our ideas in hand in it, so that I feel comfortable having shared that work with others.
Great. Thank you.
Excellent advice from Becky as well.
Yeah.
And that it's important to also give people the big picture of what you're delegating them to see how their maybe administrative or less creative tasks play into the greater effort. I actually will delegate both types of tasks, the creative tasks and the more administrative tasks, because I think it helps people sort of feel excited and energized about the project. And also, again, seeing that bigger picture helps make it understandable. Why am I counting jelly beans here? Well, here's how we're going to use that in this study. And this is what we're going to learn from this study. And involving them in the process in that way, I think makes it much more exciting and much more engaging, and makes everyone sort of feel like whatever their efforts were are contributing to this greater idea, this greater project.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think that was it for some of the questions. If not, I'll make sure to get them over to the professor and be able to get them out to people that were asking them. Again, I just want to say thank you again for everyone for joining us, especially our professor, for a really great topic and a great conversation. So I think that was really great. You will be receiving an email from us in the next little bit with a survey. Please fill it out. One of the things that we always like to remind people, these programs are from our alumni's ideas. So this was an alum that said, I think this would be a really great topic, and this is how it kind of comes together. So if you have any different thoughts or things like that, please make sure to reach out and let us know. And with that, always have a great day, and thank you so much for staying connected with Northeastern. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.